Hello there, welcome back. Today on Daddy Rolled a One, I'm going to be talking about some of the earliest play aids that were created for the game of Dungeons and Dragons right after its debut in 1974, and how many of those were created by other companies than TSR, because at the time TSR didn't actually think that those types of products would sell very well or that people would want them. And it wasn't until a few years after doing that that they began to see that supplemental products, even including things like adventure modules, things that we would assume today would be part of the earliest part of the game. TSR didn't originally think that those would do well. And so they were published by other companies. And I'm going to end the discussion talking about this book here. This is the Rogues Gallery. And partly I'm just showing it because it is an important part of D&D history, as we'll see at the end of this book, where it gets into some of the original characters in the game, and the names of those characters will be familiar to players even up to now. People who, even if you started with 5th edition, many of the names of the original characters you'll recognize, and I'm going to show you why that's the case. So just before we get started, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss when I upload new videos. And let's jump into discussion. Now, this is going to be an overview. So I'm not going to cover every product that came out between 1974 and 1980 when this book was published, because that video would be hours long. Okay, there's too much. I'm going to hit some highlights. So just know that in the comments, I didn't forget anything. So I'm not including everything, but if there is something that you want me to cover more that I don't talk about, please leave that in the comments. And also, if there's some of these things that I'm just going to go over very, very quickly, if you want a more in-depth look at those, also please leave that in the comments so that I know. Okay, so we're going to talk about how D&D, we've talked before, came out in 1974, the 3 books, right? And then in 1975, TSR does a few things. So they published these 2 supplements, Greyhawk and Blackmore. Those come out in 1975. Also in 1975, the Strategic Review, a magazine associated with TSR, is published, and to cover really all of their games. And it was very, well, I wouldn't say it was very war games focused, but it does have war games coverage in there, as well as articles on D&D. Now, as early then as that year, 1975, something else that happens is that the game was starting to get popular already. And so there was a fanzine, it's called an APA, or an amateur press, and I forget what the third A stands for, but it's basically, it's an amateur press release that's like a magazine. And there was one that was dedicated to science fiction and writing, but starting in 1974, people started writing into it, submitting articles and asking questions and content for the game of D&D. And the person who was publishing that, he didn't like that. And so a woman by the name of Lee Gold in 1975, she worked with that publisher of the original one, and she did her own version of a zine called Alarms and Excursions. This is a copy of the first issue of that came out in 1975. And it was the first fanzine, or one of the first at least, that was dedicated to the game of D&D. And what's really fun about it is that, so that came out in 1975. It is still published to this day. So there are many famous people that have worked on the game of Dungeons and Dragons over the past, 4.5, 5 decades, have written articles that first appeared in Alarms and Excursions. So Gary Gygax wrote articles for that, but even people like Jonathan Tweet and later designers that have worked on the game have written for Alarms and Excursions. Okay, so you have that being published by another company. That's 1975. Now, another fun thing that happens in 1975 is the release of this product. This is called Character Archaic, and it is the first D&D character sheets that were published. And what's interesting about this is that, again, these were not published by TSR. These were published by a company that was founded in El Segundo, California. Once left my wallet there. But it's a man and wife, Pete and Judy Karaston. And they create this company to start creating play aids for the game of Dungeons and Dragons. And so the first character sheets are not published by TSR. It's this tiny little company, which was really just a man and wife. And they started this tiny little company. And they create these character sheets. The company's called We Warriors. And they were distributed by TSR. So TSR didn't print these, they didn't publish them, but they distributed them. And in fact, in one of the early supplements of the game, which is this one, Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. So in the second printing of this, there was actually an ad inside this for the character archaic character sheets. Now mine is a later printing, so it doesn't have that ad. I already checked. But that's 1975. Now, if you watched my video on the Thief class, you know that the Rogue and Thief class, well, the Thief class originally was created by a group of people out in Santa Monica, California at Aero Hobbies. And Santa Monica and El Segundo are very, very close. So I couldn't find any proof of this online that the folks at We Warriors had ever interacted with the folks at Aero Hobbies. I do think it's possible because, the hobby just was brand new. And so Aero Hobbies might have been one of the only places where you could even buy the game of Dungeons and Dragons back then. And so they might have interacted. So that's just me making a supposition. I have no proof. It's just a guess. Okay, so that's 1975. Now, 1976, TSR publishes these two supplements. This is Eldritch Wizardry and Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. So you see what TSR is doing is they are publishing additional rules, new character classes, new spells, new monsters, new treasures. That's where they thought that the game was going. And this is it. Like for basic or original D&D, this is all you get. Now, there is one more supplement called Swords and Spells. But it is basically war games rules for going back to the roots of chainmail to turn this game back into like a tactical board war game. Okay. But so I don't really count that as part of the D&D game because it's not adding rules to D&D. It's just doing war game rules. But they're publishing these two supplements in 1976. They also switch from Strategic Review and begin publishing The Dragon. So TSR is kind of getting into that publishing thing but The Dragon is, again, it's rules, it's new, variants of classes and monsters and spells, and people are writing and asking questions about how to play the game. And Gary will sometimes write articles, Gary Gygax articles about like how he came up with ideas or sort of his philosophy of playing the game, but not play aids the way that we think of like a character sheet, for example. TSR their mind wasn't in that zone yet. They just weren't seeing it. Okay. However, they had some good success working with the We Warriors folks, distributing those character sheets, the character archaic. And so they end up distributing another product by We Warriors, 1976. This is Palace of the Vampire Queen. This is the first standalone adventure module or just adventure published for Dungeons and Dragons. So I know a lot of people, said, no, Temple of the Frog was first. It wasn't because it was in Blackmore. Okay. But that's not standalone. Okay. And also, if you actually read the Temple of the Frog in here, it actually reads more like a scenario that was written for chainmail because that's how Dave Arneson created it at the time. When he was working on that, he didn't really see the rules for D&D. So we know that Tim Kask had to do a lot of editing to try to like tighten that up. But it was technically, from Dave Arneson's standpoint, written for his Blackmore game for sure. But his Blackmore rules were closer to the chainmail fantasy supplement rules than they were to what became published as the three books in Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. So as far as the first standalone published adventure, that's 1976, Palace of the Vampire Queen. So they were loose leaf papers and they were stuck in like a little, kind of like a folder or a bag. So one of the reasons that TSR didn't think that publishing adventures really made sense, they just didn't understand because they thought everyone would just kind of want to make it themselves, just do it themselves. So if you look at the books in here, specifically, let's look at Monsters and Treasure. So when it lists the monsters in here, it also gives you a kind of treasure type that those monsters would have. And then in the back here, you have your treasure types, C, A, B, C, and D. So each monster would have a treasure type associated with it. So if you knew that you were going to have that monster and the players were going to encounter it, then you knew what kind of treasure type it had. And then you would roll percentage dice to see what you ended up with in terms of copper, silver, gold, gems, and jewelry, and then maps or magic. Okay. And then it would give you what those kinds of things would be in here. So TSR's thought and Gary's thought specifically was, well, anybody can just do that. So you just roll on those tables. Why do you need a published adventure telling you to do that? And Palace of the Vampire Queen actually does slightly prove out what Gary was saying, because a lot of it consists of just a table that shows you, like, okay, the first room, and it has a column that tells you what monster is in that room. And then the second column tells you how many hit points that monster has, or if there's more than one, it'll list all the hit points. And then the third column tells you what treasures in that room. And it's just a table. That's it. It's not an invention the way we think of it now. Now, one of the things that the Wee Warrior folks did do that was very, very kind of novel at the time was there is a little bit of a story going on with this Palace of the Vampire Queen that talks about, there's like a dwarven princess and there's this kind of stuff going on. And so there's some interesting little things in here, but it's not, it's not written like we would think of a modern adventure that's telling a story, right? And it's moving you through that story. It wasn't written that way. And that is part of the reason why the folks at TSR they weren't grasping the concept of like doing, like I said, like an adventure that we think of today. So they just didn't understand why somebody would want this. However, again, they'd had this great success working with the Wee Warrior folks distributing before. So they thought, let's just do it again and see what happens, which they did. And it actually worked really well once again. So that's 1976. Now, also 1976, Janelle Jacques. I think it's Jacques. I always am a little sensitive about how to pronounce the last name because I'm never quite sure. I've never heard it pronounced out loud before. But spelling wise, it looks like Jacques. But Janelle ends up publishing an adventure in a magazine called Dungeoneer. Actually, it does the whole magazine. It runs for 6 issues. But there was another D&D adventure that was written specifically for D&D, but it was published in that magazine, so not standalone. So that's why I'm saying Palace of the Vampire Queen is the first standalone adventure. Okay, but you are starting to see third parties. Now, Janelle Jacques ends up working with TSR for a very long time in the art department, but this was, early. And so this is an independent publication, but you're starting to see these independent companies putting out adventures because they saw a need. And the Janelle Jacques adventure that's in Dungeon is much closer in Dungeoneer is much closer to how we think of an adventure these days. So Janelle Jacques is very famous for, theories on how to do a dungeon and do it properly. And there's whole things you can find online about how to like Jacques your dungeon, which is really kind of fun. So I highly encourage you to look that up if you're into the idea of like old school dungeon design and figuring out how to do it in a very good way that your players will really enjoy. So that's 1976. Okay, so then also 1976, you've got another company jumping in, that's Judges Guild. So we've talked about them before in some of the history videos, but specifically in 1976, you have the Dungeons TAC cards. And so these are cards that a player would put in front of them that would show like what kind of weapon that they were using and what kind of attacks that they could make and things like that. So a little deck of cards. And then also they're publishing all these like individual little documents called like they'd call the initial whatever it was. Like there was a series of these things and they had letters, I or J or whatever it was. And so eventually all those are collected in 1976 into something called the Initial Package from Judges Guild. And these are player aids, things that some of them are for a campaign setting that eventually becomes the city state of the Invincible Overlord. So maps and different, things like that. But also, again, like player aids as far as like these dungeon TAC cards would be part of that, right? So things that a player would want to use at a table to kind of like make the game flow, ideally make the game flow a little bit smoother. So that's 1976. So all this time, again, you're seeing TSR is not kind of jumping on board on this. This is not something that they're seeing as something that's important. So okay, so we're going to jump to 1977. Things really start picking up here. So again, just as a reminder, this is an overview. This is not every product that came out for D&D by other companies during this year. This is just a few highlights here. So 1977 sees the release of the second adventure published by Wee Warriors and distributed by TSR called Dwarven Glory. Okay, and then you also have the Arduin trilogy of books that are published and written by David Hargrave. So a lot of people, consider these sort of like, they're done very similarly in style to the supplements and the original Little Brown books for D&D. And so a lot of people at the time kind of like just tacked them on because they were done in a similar manner. And it's just a bunch of variant rules. Okay, so you have Ardenwen, then you have Judges Guild publishing officially, City State of the Invincible Overlord, and also Wilderlands of High Fantasy. So they had, started City State in 1976, but you get like a nice package in 77. And again, you get the Wilderlands of High Fantasy, and they're tied together. Okay. And then you also have other magazines that are jumping on board. So you've got Dragon from TSR in 1976, but then in 77, you get White Dwarf from Games Workshop. You get Space Gamer. So magazines are exploding. And again, full of options and things for mostly players, but also DMs. Okay. And then you also have finally TSR starts to kind of get the sense. Now it's only been 3 years, but you've had other companies doing supplements and play aids since 75. And so TSR in 77 jumps in on this idea of these sort of player aids, and in this case it's a Dungeon Master aid, the Monster and Treasure Assortment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but basically what these were books that showed you basically how to stock a dungeon. And it's going back to what I was talking about with when we were discussing Palace of the Vampire Queen. So how to stock a dungeon with the monsters and the treasure. So, and they were divided into levels. So levels 1 through 3, and then they had 4 through 6. Okay. So that's 1977. Then you get to 1978. Now, finally, after 4 years, TSR finally gets in on the adventure game. So they published that year G1, and also G2 and G3. So these, I just showed one here, but this is the Studying of the Hill Giant Chief. This is the first adventure module for D&D published by TSR. Okay, so that's this one, 1978. All right, they also published the D series, which was a follow-up to this. I don't have D1 as a monochrome, but I do have D2, Shrine of the Kuo-toa. And then they also published S1. This is a much later printing. It was originally published in a cover that, what was more like it was pink, but it was, they call these the monochrome colors. So S1 did have one of those, but this was published also 1978. So they jump in pretty heavily. They published a lot of modules that year, I think at least 7. So it was G1, 2, and 3, D1, 2, and 3. And then S1 are all published. Okay. And then you've got the Monster and Treasure Assortment 7 through 9. Okay, levels 7 through 9. Now, at this point, I'm just going to now focus on the TSR related stuff because, again, that's what I really wanted to get to here. So TSR starts to see like these player aids and DM aids can be something that it could work for them. Okay, so that's 1978. Then in 1979, they published the Dungeon Master screen. They published the permanent character folder and adventure records, and they published the non-player character records. So I have one here. Now this, again, it was originally published in 1979. As you see, my copy is a later printing from 1981. But these are character sheets for non-player characters. And normally what you would use these for, they could be used for a DM, but a lot of times a player would use these because of your hirelings. So you have retainers, you have hirelings, and so you would use these character sheets for using them when you were going dungeon delving. Okay, so that's 1979. Okay, now we get to 1980, and you have the release of the Dungeon Master Adventure Log. You have player character record sheets for Dungeons and Dragons, and then you have Monsters and Treasure Assortment set 1 through 3. So this is levels 1 through 9. So this is basically a collection of the other 3 individual Monster and Treasure Assortments that had been published before as levels 1 through 3, 4 through 6, and 7 through 9. This collects them all together. So this is again, this is just kind of a product of early D&D and how the TSR folks kind of saw you keying a dungeon. So, on this for level 2 of the dungeon, you've got a warlock, and it tells you how many hit points. Very exciting 1 hit point. I know a lot of people, balk at that, because modern D&D, you would never have that happen. But in old school D&D, a wizard has D4 hit points, so you had a 25% chance of getting a starting hit point of 1. Okay, but then it just goes down and it tells you all their attacks, what kind of spells they have. They might have a magic item other than a sword or a miscellaneous weapon. Okay, and then you've got wyvern, orcs, werebear, elves, and it just goes through into level by level and tells you what kind of monsters you could find and what kind of treasures that they would have. So this is how you would run a dungeon in the old days. A lot of times you might not, you might have it drawn out, but you don't know what's in the room. People just, would wait. And then when you went in the room, the DM would roll and find out what was in there. So again, that's a lot of things where people would say like, oh, early dungeon designs don't make sense because you have, mummies in a room next to trolls. So that's not really how you were supposed to use it. But I think there was a lot of confusion. And so a lot of people think that that's what early D&D was like. And a lot of people back then, well, maybe not a lot, but people did play it that way because they didn't really understand that that's not how you were supposed to use this kind of thing. You were supposed to sort of use it in a way that made sense. Okay. But some people just didn't get that. Even people early publishing adventures. So like the Palace of the Vampire Queen I was talking about. So there are a lot of rooms in there. They're just like full of goblins that have nothing to do with vampires or undead or anything like that. And it's kind of like, well, why would goblins want to live there? So that's early D&D. However, another thing that is published in 1980, we've got the World of Greyhawk folio. I talked about that in my video on the World of Greyhawk setting. And then you've got this book, The Rogues Gallery. So this is going to be the focus of the rest of the video here, talking about this book and specifically talking about why I like this book, how you could use it in games even today, even without, looking at the mechanics, the stats, but then also some of the early players of the game. So there's a great piece of art here by the artist Darlene. This is Paladin and Warhorse. And what this does is it essentially just gives you a table. Well, first you've got, figuring out your age, your appearance, your possessions, and then your sanity and your general tendencies. That's for your NPCs that you would have. So this is essentially just a list of NPCs, and it's divided by class. So here you've got your assassins. You can see my video here on the assassin class. There's a link, but you've got the race, male or female. You've got the alignment, and then all their stats, and then what level they are, their hit points, their AC, and then this one is like their skills. For us, they have some thief skills plus their assassination skills, which they don't list here because it tells you that those are really level based, so it's not listed. But you've got that. Then you've got your bards. Okay. And then, again, it's just going to keep going. So you've got clerics, you've got fighters. Now, there's no names or anything like that here. So is this useful for a 5th edition player? Probably not, because, you don't really need this anymore. Like, now you can just grab this stuff online. But back in the day, you got to remember, we didn't have internet to like look things up. So the best place that you could get things like this would be a book like this. Or maybe if you, subscribe to one of those magazines, they might have articles. But, the best place that you would want to go to get a bunch of NPCs if you needed them really quick. And the idea was that a DM doesn't have time to look how many monks are here. Like, how long would that take you to roll all of those up if you rolled them and created them on your own? And then, looked up all the different skills and all that kind of stuff. Well, now you just have it here. Okay. There's a fun piece of art by the artist, Jeff D. Always famous for these bell-bottom style pants. Anytime you see this in 1980s D&D art, you know that that's Jeff E. doing that art. He loved doing that. But anyway, you've got multi-class characters here. Another classic drawing of a paladin. This is Jeff D. again. Okay, and then you've got rangers, thieves. Okay. And then here's a fun one, sages. So I just did a video recently on the sage and the merchant. So there's this whole section here on sages, and it tells you what their areas of focus are as far as like what they would study, what their knowledge would be. Then you've got a whole thing here of 0 level characters. That was another thing that was big in early D&D that we don't really do anymore in like say 5th edition. But you would have 0 level characters. Okay. Here's the part that could be handy though. Caravans. So there's a whole section here on caravans. and who is in the caravan. So again, you might not use the stats for this in a 5th edition game. You could, because they're all 3 to 18. So you could use the stats, and then you would just know what the derivative statistic was for having a strength of 13 is +1. Okay, but it tells you how many merchants are in there, how many drovers, how many mules, how many wagons, how many mercenary leaders, and what their levels and classes are, and then how many guards, how many followers. So there's 4 different types of caravans. Then you've got city guards, city watch, and border patrols. Okay, so all of this again is stuff that you could use in a game today, regardless of the edition. Really, you've got pilgrims, and then you've got different groups of pilgrims, and then you've got bandits and buccaneers. Okay, so you have all of that. Okay, and then you have some fancy monsters that have things that are just a little bit that are more difficult to run on the fly, that have abilities that are difficult to do on the fly. So you've got the Quaddle, the Kareen, and the Shadoo here, and their psionic powers and things like that. You've got liches. Okay, and then you have a thing of dungeon parties and a whole different list of dungeon parties, what their alignments are and who is included in that. So again, you could have some rival adventuring parties. I talked about that in a recent video as well. So now this is the big part that I wanted to talk about, which is personality. So these are some of the earliest players of the game, and you're going to start to recognize these names. So I'm just going to do like a brief overview of who some of these people are. Okay, so first off, we have the character Ararat, played by Tim Giardini. So Tim was hired at TSR in 1977 and worked there through 1983. However, he was technically too young to be hired in 1977. I think he was 14. And I believe at the time, the age of employment, at least in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, was 15. So they said he didn't actually start working until 1978, but he did start in 1977. His mother worked at a graphical printing place that was responsible for doing all the early typesetting of the early D&D books. And so that's kind of how her son got connected to it. Tim got connected, and he worked in the mail order dungeon hobby shop, and then later he worked in the TSR mail room, and then later, even still, he worked in shipping and sales. Okay, so he played in Rob Kuntz's Caliburn campaign. We're going to talk about Rob in a second here, but he helped play test the early Paladin and early Ranger classes. So Ararat, if you read here, used to be a Ranger. But it says like he got too kind of fed up with, being like following the rules of being a ranger, the restrictions. And so he just kind of became a fighter. And the thing was, Tim talked about that in an interview. He basically, like, most of his characters were like that. Like he would try to play paladins. He wasn't good at playing a lawful good character. He would tend to make it lawful good. And then that paladin then would lose his paladinhood and become a fighter. And rangers back then were very, very similar. They had a lot of restrictions in terms of the amount of wealth they could carry and all that kind of stuff. And so Tim didn't really like following those restrictions. And so he was sort of famous in the group for having characters start out as something else and then reverting to like a basic fighter, essentially. So that's Tim, and that's Ararat. Okay, now here we go. Bigby. Everyone knows who Gary Gygax is. I'm not going to explain that. But Bigby. So if you look in the 5th edition Player's Handbook, you are going to see spells named after Bigby. Bigby's, clenching fist and things like that. The hand spells, the Bigby hand spells are kind of famous. And they've been in pretty much every edition of D&D. This is where that name comes from. That was Gary Gygax's magic user character, one of them, okay, that he played back in the early days of the game when they were kind of still playtesting things. Okay, so I'm just going to go quickly here, just kind of cover some of these important people. So I really don't know how to pronounce this character's name. I believe it's Ciatitle Chodar Northman, but the player is Jean Wells. Okay, so Jean was hired at TSR in 1979, and she was the first female game designer that they hired. So she had applied for a job. She was a player at the game. She talked to Gary Gygax, and he hired her even though she didn't have any game design experience, because as she quotes, she says he hired her for her imagination, and he thought he could just teach her later along the line how to, the game mechanics. Okay. So she's a very famous person kind of, in the history of TSR, not just because she was a female game designer, but because of the things that she worked on. So she worked on editing, let's see, I have it over here, set aside. So she worked on editing this adventure. This is White Plume Mountain S2. Okay, coincidentally, this is the very first adventure module that I ever got as a kid, that I paid for with my own money rather than being given as a gift. And the reason was it's one of the shortest. It's only 16 pages, and so it cost $4.50 instead of usually they cost $6 at the time. So that's why I bought this one, because it was cheap. But you've got your classic some Jeff D artwork here on the front. So that is, she helped edit this very famous module. Okay. And she also did some artwork for the revised printing of the Monster Manual. Okay. So in later printings, she did the Eye of the Deep. Okay. And then she also did the Violet Fungi. And she did the Sumatran rat. It's like a giant rat. So she did the artwork for that. Okay. So it's just funny. Also, I just think to me, it's funny that these early people in the game had more than one role in the company. Everyone was kind of doing everything. So everyone at a certain point usually ended up working in shipping and distribution. But game editors would also do game design. And then here you have Jean Wells hired as a game designer. She's also doing artwork, right? So it's just showing you kind of how small and scrappy the company was at the time. Okay, a couple other things for Jean Wells. She edited module B2, Keep on the Borderlands. So this ends up being sort of like her biggest edit job, just in terms of the sheer number of these that were distributed. So this module was distributed in the 1981 box set, Moldvay box set. We've talked about that before. But just because of that, and that set sold so many copies, and this was included in every set. So that ends up being something that she was known for. She was the first person to write the Sage Advice column for Dragon Magazine, where people would write in and ask questions, the Dragon number 31. And then I guess probably the biggest thing that we could talk about with her, and this could be a whole video just in and of itself, was this adventure. This is B3 Palace of the Silver Princess. Now, this was originally published with a completely different cover. It was orange, and it was by just Jean Wells. Okay, so she wrote that adventure. It's too much to get into here, but very famously, that after it had gone to the printer and it was getting ready for distribution, one of the TSR execs saw it, hadn't seen it before. There were some things in there that the executives didn't like, and they actually scrapped it. They pulped it, got rid of it. So there were very few copies of it left that some of the employees kind of held on to. And so they're floating around out there. They cost a ton of money just because there were very, very few of them. And TSR then has Tom Moldvay, who wrote the basic set that this version of this module was written for, the basic set. He wrote that. And so they had him come in and kind of change stuff that Jean did. So that's why you see his name on here. It was not originally part of this. Okay. So after this, Jean kind of felt that like she never really got a chance again to sort of, do things that she wanted to do at TSR. She wanted to write another adventure, and she kind of felt like they never gave her a chance, but she doesn't. She ends up not doing that. So she leaves the company and didn't really do any more work in the game design community again, which is really unfortunate. So, but that's Jean Wells. And then her character again that we saw in here. So, which was a magic user. Okay. So then you have Fletcher Dandaria, and the player for this is Bob Waldbauer. So Bob is mostly known for writing adventures in Dragon Magazine. So very famously, one in Dragon Magazine number 75 in 1983, which of course came out after this, but Can Seaport Be Saved? That's kind of the main thing that he'd be known for, but also was an early playtester. So helped playtest the A series of modules that came out in the late 70s, early 80s, and also Q1 Queen of the Demon Web Pits. He was one of the playtesters there. So he's part of that group of those early players of the game. So that's Bob's character, Fletcher, which is a bard. He's a bard. Okay, so one of the very few that you would have back then, because we talked about before, bards were originally it was like a triple class. You had to start as a fighter, then move to a thief, and then become a druid, and then at that point you were a bard. So that's his bard character there. Okay, then you have Eric's cousin. Funny name. This is Ernie Gygax's character. Fighter magic user now, very interestingly, lawful evil alignment. So there were a lot of evil characters back then. And partly it's because the way that the players played them. A lot of times the dungeon master would say, what you're doing is evil, and so you're going to be evil now. It's not that the player necessarily wanted the character to be evil, but through actions, the DM would kind of say, oh, you're an evil character. So Ernie Gygax is Gary Gygax's son. So he was involved at the very, very beginning, early play testing. He played in the original game when Dave Arneson ran a Blackmore game to show Gary Gygax how the game worked. Ernie was there along with Rob Kuntz and Rob's brother Terry, and Dave Magari, who had come with Dave Arneson. And I think that's everybody. I might be missing one. But anyway, Ernie was there at the very, very beginning. And then he also helped play test the early games of D&D 1972 or thereabouts in Gary's Greyhawk campaign that Gary created to play test D&D before it was published in 1974. So that's one of 3 of Ernie's characters that are in here. I think it's 3. Then you have Grimslade, played by Harold Johnson. So Harold, famous person at TSR in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So this is a magic user. And Harold began playing D&D in 1976 and then goes to Gen Con in 1977, ends up meeting a bunch of the folks, and then he applies for a job that he sees in 1978. And it kept going in between different kinds of what the job actually was going to be. But eventually he is hired as an editor, and he edited a lot of different books, including the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. And he contributed rules to this. He contributes rules to the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's, again, you're seeing that crossover between he's hired as an editor, but he's also doing game design, okay, which a lot of people were doing back then. He wrote probably one of the most famous modules, this one, C1. This is the Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan. Okay, so by Harold Johnson. Also notice this other name on here, Jeff Leeson. That's going to come up in a second. Okay, so early module, famous adventure module written by Harold Johnson. Okay, and then he also worked at TSR all the way up through the 90s, and even to the point where he was doing early design work for 3rd edition, which was published by WotC in 2000. So Harold was still there. He was one of the few that kind of kept on with the company over the time. Okay, so then next up, we have this character here, Gormadoc, played by Greg Fleming. Now, Greg is mostly an artist. That's kind of what he was known for. Did play testing as well. Again, he's part of that group, that initial group. They all kind of knew each other and played together in that, the Lake Geneva circle was pretty small of gamers, so they all kind of knew each other. But he does art for this. He does art for C1, Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan. There's like an art booklet in here for DMs to show players when certain things come up, and he did some of those pieces. He also does this illustration here. So this is his character, Gormadoc. Okay, but then he also illustrates Lawrence Schick's Lanolin, and that's who that is. So you can see this is by Greg Fleming. And then he does artwork for the game Top Secret. Some of the artwork in here is by him. And then he is hired as part of the art staff in Dragon Magazine. So he's listed for quite a number of issues as being part of the overall monthly art staff. So that's Greg Fleming. Then you've got Lanolin, played by Lawrence Schick. So this is a chaotic, evil fighter magic user, elf. And you see, one of the other things I should point out in this, all these characters have these crazy items that normally you wouldn't necessarily have. So I'm not going to read them all here, but you can just see all the different magic items that he has. But some of the characters have things that aren't necessarily part of what you would think of. So this one, I like this. This is Grimslade, the magic user. So he's a strong believer in free will and customarily refuses to accept orders or suggestions from the other party members. And to further protect his free will, he's had a permanent suggestion cast on himself to cause him to reply in half-truths to all questions he's forced to answer. Like, it's just really fun, kind of creative stuff. And that's what you get in this section of this book. And again, I don't have time to go through all of it, but all of these characters really have a lot of personality to them and are doing goofy things like this just to kind of make them different, because that's just how they played back then. It was in the early parts of the game, and I have talked about this in many videos before, there was almost a little bit of like kind of player versus player where you were trying to get the one up on other players. Like people would go dungeon adventuring on their own so that they didn't have to share the treasure with their fellow players. Like, they might get so far and then come back to town, and then that player might call up the DM and say, "Hey, are you free now? Like, I want to keep going. Like, I know how far we got, so I know we've cleared out that path up to that point. So I want to push just a little bit further and see if I can find some stuff and take that treasure for myself." And then later the whole group would go in and that treasure's already been cleaned out. Like, they used to play like that, which is again why you see a lot of these characters with this evil alignment, is because they were doing things like that to kind of like get one up on their fellow players. Okay, so that's Lanolin. Now let's talk about Lawrence Schick, the person who plays Lanolin. Again, famous in TSR history and game design history in general for the tabletop role-playing games. So Lawrence, he first starts working at TSR in the late 70s. And he's hired as a game designer and then the head of the editorial staff. So he wrote that module S2 that I showed before, the one that was edited by Gene Wells. So Lawrence Schick writes this module. Okay, so that's his. And then he also did a bunch of monsters that were in the Fiend Folio. So you can see my video on the Fiend Folio to see which monsters he created. But the Aarakocra is one of the more popular ones that you would know of today. That was his. Okay, I think the Tabaxi was also his, if I remember correctly. So he also hired Tom Moldvay and Dave Cook, two designers at TSR, very famous. So again, Tom Moldvay wrote the basic set for D&D 1981. And then Dave Cook worked with Steve Marsh to write the expert set, which was the continuation of the basic set. Okay, and we've talked about that in my videos on those before. So he also worked on Star Frontiers, so TSR's entry into the science fiction games. Okay, my pile's getting pretty high here, so it's not all fitting on camera. So he works on Star Frontiers. And then in 1991, he publishes this book, Heroic World. So this is a history and guide to role-playing games up to that point. So it's just all these different games and the companies that publish them. So this is one of the first books that was attempting to kind of catalog all of this kind of stuff. So this is a fun book. It's definitely outdated now. The organization of it, as far as like how the layout, it's probably not the best, but it's still an important part of role-playing game history. So if you can find a copy of that, I would highly recommend adding it to your collection if you're into that kind of thing. So one of the cool things, though, about Lawrence Schick is he's still involved in role-playing game stuff. So he was actually hired by Larian Studios in their Dublin office to act as their expert writer on Baldur's Gate 3, which is topical because that just came out as of the time of this video. So this is August of 2023, and that video game just came out very, very recently. So he worked on that. Okay, so that's his player, Lanolin, kind of a goofy name. Now, you have Lasiverin, I guess, the Dark, played by Alan Hammock. Now, here is Lasiverin, and you see artwork by Jeff D. And again, we know it's Jeff D because we've got our bell bottoms here. Okay, I know these are boots, but it's the same style. Okay, so this is Alan Hammock's character, and it is, of course, an assassin. Okay, lawful evil assassin. He has all these different names that he goes by, which are kind of fun. Okay, so what do we know about Alan Hammock? Well, if you watched my video on the assassin class that debuted in the Blackmore Supplement 2, you know that there's a theory that Alan Hammock played the first assassin. Okay, and I also mentioned, coincidentally, that Alan Hammock, he is the editor of the Top Secret game. Again, we talked about this before in that video, but there are assassins in Top Secret. Okay, so that's the assassination department there. Okay, so that's Alan Hammock's character. So I just think it's funny that it's listed in here. So this, and I'm not sure, but this might be the assassin that everybody is referring to as being the first one. But definitely that's Alan Hammock. Okay, so then you have Luther, played by Helen Cook. So he's a monk, and this is Luther right here on the side. And Helen Cook is the wife of David Cook, and she did play testing for D&D. So she wasn't part of TSR, but she does do play testing and ends up having a mess here. I've got too many books. she ends up helping play test this module, Dwellers of the Forbidden City, which is written by her husband, David Cook. Okay, so that's Helen Cook. And then you have Gary Gygax, of course. We all know who that is. There's another character in here, another magic user, Mordenkainen. So again, if you know TSR 5th edition spells, you know Mordenkainen's name. This is where it comes from. That was Gary Gygax's character. Okay, or one of them. Now we've got Phoebus, played by Jeff Leeson. We saw his name before on that module C1. Okay. The Hidden Shrine of Tomoe-chan. So Jeff Leeson worked at TSR, and he was famous for helping edit the Dungeon Master's Guide that we talked about a little bit before, the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. And it's really funny. He has a quote, and I talked about in the Dungeon Master's Guide video about how Gary's writing can be like a little, they call it high Gygaxian. It can be a little hard to kind of get through. And so Jeff Leeson was interviewed, and he said Gary's prose and use of language was challenging to him and his fellow proofreaders. And he said, but we soon got accustomed to Gary's liturgy of archaic idiophones and aphorisms. Sorry, I can't even pronounce it. So I thought it was kind of funny that like he ends up talking the way Gary would talk, to say how difficult it was to like read through Gary's work. So that's Jeff Leeson. So he works on, again, C1. Later on, he works for Judges Guild on City State of the Invisible Overlord. And he works at another company called Mayfair Games that publishes supplements for Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so that's Jeff Leeson. And then you also have Rob Kuntz has a character in here. Oh, so really interestingly, Jeff Leeson's character is this lizard man. So you see he's a fighter, but it said race lizard man. And it's because he was resurrected, and that was the only thing that was available at the time when the resurrection spell worked. So he ends up playing a lizard man. Again, very atypical for the time. Okay, then you have Rigby by Gary Gygax, a neutral good cleric. Rigsby's not as famous, I'd say, as Bigby. Okay, and then you have Robilar by Rob Kuntz. Okay, this is the one I wanted to talk about here. So Rob Kuntz met Gary Gygax in 1968, so way before D&D was even on the horizon. Okay, so he was an original player when Dave Arneson taught the Blackmore game to Gary Gygax. I talked about that a second ago. So Rob and his brother Terry, and so that was in 1972. He was playing this character when Gary Gygax started to start making his own game in the Greyhawk campaign as the test to be what would become D&D. So this character's been around, since the very, very beginning. So this is Robilar, Rob Kuntz's character, fighter, lawful evil. So again, most of these ones, I just think it's really funny. There's not very many good ones. Most of them are neutral or at best or evil. There's a few good ones, but Rob ends up creating a campaign called Calibrun is his world. And then he has a castle in there, Castle El Raja Key. And that is kind of like his version of like a Greyhawk or a Blackmore, right? So it's very famous in the annals of like early tabletop role-playing game history is this campaign that he runs. He was the 6th employee hired by TSR, and he worked with Gary Gygax on Supplement 1, which was Greyhawk. So you see his name's even on here. So on the front. So that's Rob Kuntz and who he is. So he was the first character to survive through the Tomb of Horrors, which again, if you're an old school gamer, you know what that's a claim to fame. So that Tomb of Horrors module, I showed that earlier, that green one that came out in 1978. I have the green cover version, not the original cover. But Tomb of Horrors is notorious for basically having been designed to just challenge players, not characters. It's challenging players and how they think and can they outwit the module that was written to basically defeat them. And there's just tons of stuff in there, traps and things that are save or die, or sometimes you don't even get a save. If you just go in the wrong place, your character's going to die, or a lot of things can happen to them. So Robilar was the first character to make it out alive of that dungeon. So we talked about Ernie Gygax before, but he has, again, a few characters in here. So if you see he's got certain. Okay, so just Ernie's name is Ernest, which is an anagram for certain. Okay, so that was so popular to do that back in the day. So if you are looking at your, let's say you've got a 5th edition player's handbook and you're looking through the spells and you see one of the spells, I forget the exact name of the spell, but it's named after Drawmidge. Okay, so Drawmidge is just Jim Ward backwards. Jim Ward was an early TSR employee, most famously for Metamorphosis Alpha, and then worked on the Gamma World game, wrote that game. So that's his character, just his name backwards. So here you've got Ernie Gygax. Now, I mean, he was young at the time, so it's fine, but it's just goofy that his name, this is an anagram of his name. So this is his character, a lawful good cleric. Now, Gary Gygax was also known to do that. So that's why you see a lot of things in D&D that have X's and Y's and G's in their names. But also he ends up, and I had the module here earlier, but G1, the Studying of the Hill Giant Chief. So the main bad guy in that module is basically Dave Arneson's last name, Arneson, spelled backwards. And then Gary says some not very nice things about that giant. And so I'm not sure if he did that on purpose to make fun of Dave. Some people think that he did. Dave Arneson, for his part, has a very famous character of his Blackmore campaign called the Egg of Coot. So Egg is EGG, of course, and although we call him Gary Gygax, his name is Ernest Gary Gygax, EGG. So, again, that most people think that the Egg of Coot might have been around before Dave met Gary, but it was just kind of a coincidence that in the 1977 First Fantasy campaign, I've talked about that before, when Dave talks about the Egg of Coot, he has some very unflattering things to say about the Egg of Coot. And again, a lot of people thought that was sort of like Gary and Dave's way of like taking snipes at one another through their writing. So even though, again, most people say the Egg of Coot existed before Dave's relationship with Gary Gygax, it was a coincidence that it was Egg, but then he does use it maybe as a way to kind of snipe at Gary. So who knows if that's true or not, but it's a theory that some people have. So now you've got Talbot, played by Dave Cook. So this is a chaotic neutral fighter. Okay, so Talbot is a centaur. And again, same thing as like with Phoebus, got resurrected as a centaur, and then the player decided to keep playing it. So Dave Cook, we talked about a second ago, hired by Lawrence Schick. And one of the things that he did was, again, he wrote the expert set for basic D&D, but he has just a long litany of things that he wrote. He wrote the Oriental Adventures book. He designed 2nd edition advanced D&D, tons of module credits under his name. So just too much to list here, but very famous game designer, Dave Cook. And he still referees games. If you go to I think it's GaryCon or it might be Gamehole Con, at one of those two conventions that are really focused on old school gaming. He's there and he will run you through like basic D&D type adventures. One of my friends on Twitter got to play in one of his games, which is super cool. Okay, then you've got Tensor, played by Ernie Gygax. So let's look at that name there. Tensor, lawful good magic user. Remember over here, we've got certain, lawful good cleric. So I guess we kind of know why it's called Tensor. But again, Tensor's floating disc. I mean, this Tensor is one of the first magic user characters in a D&D game, played by Ernie Gygax, because he was there at the very beginning. So that's why all those spells are named after him. And that's really why I wanted to show this book, was to show you guys where those spell names come from. Okay, so then last up here, we have Valerius, played by Errol Otis. So Errol Otis, famous artist for D&D. So I'm not going to show you everything that he did, but a few things that we have talked about before. So he does the artwork for this is the set that I started with, the basic set for Dungeons and Dragons, 1981. This is my original box. And so he does this artwork as well as the follow-up artwork for the expert set. This is the one written by Dave Cook. So he does this artwork. He has a very distinctive art style, very famous for kind of drawing these sort of weird type things. Also did the cover for the deities and demigods. This is a wraparound cover, actually. So you see you've got some kind of weird creature here. And then this is the version of the book that has the Cthulhu mythos in it that I have talked about before. because eventually this was excised from the book in later printings. But he does the art for all of these creatures in here in the Cthulhu section, which again just kind of fits his style because he's just kind of well known. I mean, look at that. That's classic Errol Otis art right there. So very big on does stuff with mushrooms and hallucinogenic fungi and weird acid pools and things like that. That's just, here's another one. So really love his art. But his character in here, Valerius, is sort of this, swashbuckling dandy type, which I think fits perfectly. And of course, then he does his own art for that. Okay, so that is our look at the Rogues Gallery from 1981 and early D&D supplements, or not supplements, play aids. Let's call them play aids for the game that were published by other companies. So again, if you would like to see any, an in-depth look at any of those that I talked about, or if there's ones that, I didn't mention, and I know I didn't mention a lot, so because I just couldn't get through them all. This video is already my longest video yet. So please leave that in the comments below and let me know that you'd like to see me talk about those. Also in the comments below, you will find links where you can join me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and where you can buy a little something from my shop, like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, or poster to help support my channel. I don't have a Patreon or anything like that right now. So if you want to support me, you want to see me making more videos, one of the best ways that you can help support right now would be buy something in my shop. And so with that, I would like to say thank you so much for watching. This is, again, I know this is my longest video yet, and I do appreciate you watching all the way to the end here. And so thank you again for watching. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, now the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I was working on my notes for this video. So I had to take a lot of notes. You might have heard me page turning when I was recording the video. And that's just because a lot of those early timers that at the very end of the video where I talked about those early original players, I wanted to make sure that I captured all of the main things that they had kind of worked on at TSR and what they were known for. And as it was, I realized I missed a few of them because I try not to look at my notes when I'm talking, because then it sounds a little too robotic. So but I did take a lot of notes. And so while I was taking notes, I was having a little bit of bourbon. So I did my notes last night. So today's Tuesday during the day, but I did my notes last night on Monday night. And so after dinner, and I just had a little tiny bit of this. One of my people that watches this part of the video mentioned that they thought their drinking habits were just different from mine because they were bourbon drinkers. And I realized I hadn't featured a bourbon yet. So this is not a fancy bourbon by any means. I got this for about $22, which is actually a really good price for what this is. This is LARCENY bourbon from it's small batch, but it's 92 proof, which is what I wanted to point out. So it's a little bit higher proof than normally you'd get an 80 proof would be a typical mixed or alcoholic spirit. So 92 is a little bit high. So this is a little bit more on the wheated side. So I guess kind of similar to a Maker's Mark, which tends to be a little sweeter. Maker's Mark's more corn, but it does have wheat in it. This one, I think it's a good mixing bourbon. It's what I would call not a fancy bottle. I would call it I think it's a good Monday night bourbon, which is when I was drinking it. So there's that. Then listening to Paul Simon, Graceland, 1986. So I'll be honest, when this album came out, I was a teenager. I thought it was old people music and I hated it. And then a few years later, I went to college and I was living in the dorms and somebody had it on CD and he was playing it. And it's just, it was familiar to me. I didn't like it. I didn't collect it at the time, but I was just familiar with the music. And then it was, years later, I was probably in my 30s or maybe even early 40s by the time it kind of came around. I was like, this is a really good album. And I don't know why I just, as a kid, thought that it was, like I said, old people music. I was really more into punk and new wave back then and ska. And so this is just not something that was on my radar. But anyway, this is a reprint for the 25th anniversary of the record. I believe it was 25th. Yeah. And so on 180 gram. And it's just great. So this is something that, if you have a vinyl collection, this is something I would recommend you should have in your collection. So with that, again, cheers. And thank you so much for watching. Talk to you next time.